Hello and welcome to History by the Pint, a new podcast that covers all things history and archaeology in the time it takes to drink a pint. My name is Alex Rowson, I'm a TV producer and author, and with me as always is Glyn Davis, a curator at Colchester Castle Museum, and Chris Shavitsky, a lecturer and researcher in Rome. This time round, we're going to be having a drink and a chat about one of my favourite archaeological sites, ancient Pella in northern Greece, the birthplace of Alexander the Great. So have either of you guys been to northern Greece before?
No, I haven't.
No.
Yeah, it's a fascinating place to go. I can't recommend it highly enough, really. It's got all the lovely landscape of Greece. It's got the beaches and the mountains. It's got Thessaloniki, the second city of Greece. But it tends to be overlooked a little bit, I guess, in terms of more people go to places like the Peloponnese or Athens or the islands. I mean, there is so much to see in Greece that I can understand that perhaps it's not as well known as elsewhere, but it should be, because northern Greece essentially encompasses the ancient territory of Macedonia, which is, of course, the land of Alexander the Great, the land that Alexander was born, the kingdom that produced him. And, well, you guys know I'm a bit of an Alexander fan, right? I spent a lot of time doing
research. I mean, no, you
wrote
wrote a book on him because you hate him, I do assume. Yeah,
but during my research, I was lucky enough to spend a year out there and go around and look at all the archaeological sites. And one of the reasons that I wanted to write about Alexander is, when I first visited northern Greece in 2014, I think it was just one of those experiences where I was absolutely blown away by how many incredible archaeological sites there were, and just the amazing museums and the new discoveries, and especially that I didn't really know too much about it, again, because it gets overlooked a little bit. So I think that really sparked my interest into ancient Macedonia and what was this place like? How did it become, a formative place for the young Alexander? And what's interesting about it is that the ancient Macedonians are sometimes written off as a silent voice of antiquity. Not many sources survive in their own words. None of the great histories that they did write survive. And because of that, we mainly come to their story through either the eyes of Athenians or others like that. So you have a sort of distance from them a little bit. But what's really interesting, I think, is that the archaeology is beginning to, illuminate this lost world that for a long time was on the periphery of the Greek world. I mean, it really only came into its ascendancy in the mid-4th century BC under Alexander's father, Philip II, and he was the guy that really made Macedonia into a major power. It went from a relative backwater, really, into one of the major power players in the northern Aegean. And it's just a very, very interesting story, I think, because the archaeology didn't really start to emerge until after the Second World War. There were a few interesting discoveries before that. In the mid-19th century, there was a big discovery of a royal palace, which belonged to the first capital of ancient Macedonia, a place called Ege, which is where the modern village of Vergina is. And that capital retained its importance throughout the 4th century BC and later periods as well, as the sort of the foundation stone of the kingdom of Macedonia. It was where the kings were buried. It was where, a lot of the key ceremonial parts of court culture were carried out. But in the probably the late 5th century BC, the heart of the kingdom sort of moved across to the east to a place called Pella. Do you guys know much about Pella at all, if I mention that?
It's been in the news, hasn't it? They've either restored something or reopened.
Yeah.
There's been some recent restoration carried out at the site, I think I remember reading.
Yeah, so like I said, the excavations really started after the Second World War, and what's really interesting about Pella is not only is it was the capital of Macedonia and the birthplace of Alexander the Great, it was also where archaeology in northern Greece sort of began. After northern Greece or Macedonia became part of the Greek state just before the First World War, people started to look at the archaeology, and there was a few, diggings in the area of Pella. Archaeologists sort of knew where it was. There was nothing to be seen. It was just sort of open fields and a couple of villages, but people sort of had a vague idea of where it was, and a couple of trenches went in before
Did they know it was Pella? Or is it a case of they knew there's a site there because you see anything from field walking or there's a few remains, but did they know that this is Pella and the significance of it?
They knew the significance of it. They knew it was the capital of ancient Macedonia. They sort of had a fairly good understanding of where it was because it was sort of on the Via Egnatia, the sort of major Roman thoroughfare, which was based on a previous royal road, and they knew from itineraries and things like that it was, I think, 40 kilometers northwest of Thessaloniki, and so they sort of knew that there should be something big in this area. There was some surviving ruins that were called the Baths of Alexander in sort of local folklore, and there were sort of various other indications that Pella might be there. But the confirmation that it was Pella only really came after the Second World War, when essentially a local archaeologist was working in the area, and he was called in by a local family who'd been digging a basement, and they'd hit some column drums and didn't really know what they were. So this archaeologist came in and basically started excavating the column drums, and this building began to emerge, and it was a massive, massive building, dated to the Hellenistic period, so the period just after Alexander the Great.
I bet that family regrets calling the archaeologist, because I take it they lost their house and everything in order to excavate it at a later date.
So they started out trying to dig a basement, and like you say, they were told to move on pretty quickly, I think. But I think, there's also a sense of people being proud of their heritage and antiquity in their back garden. And what was really interesting about this dig is that the archaeologists realised quite quickly that actually it was this, humongous Hellenistic house. Really, really huge dimensions, really well appointed. And it had these just incredible river pebble mosaics. One was of the wine god Dionysus riding a leopard. The other was of two Macedonians on a lion hunt. And what's really interesting, and we know that the lions probably were around in northern Greece during the Hellenistic period, and the lions were royal quarry, the quarry of the king and his closest followers or companions. So here you actually had a mosaic that, was not mythical. It was perhaps two named people, perhaps Alexander the Great himself and one of his companions killing a mountain lion. So for a first big discovery of Macedonian archaeology, you couldn't really ask for too much more. I mean, it was this incredible insight into the richness of Pella. And ever since then, archaeologists have been toiling away to unveil or reveal more of the city, and they've revealed, a fair amount of it.
Do they, Alex, know the sort of full extent of the city, even if they haven't excavated it? So a bit like Pompeii, actually very little's excavated, isn't it, I think? But of course they know sort of what the entire area is to a degree. Is it similar in that way?
Yes and no. I mean, they have the main cemeteries that sort of ringed the city, so they have a sort of good understanding of its extent. But really, the main part that's been discovered is essentially what was a product of Alexander the Great's conquest after he died in 323 BC, and his empire sort of quite quickly disintegrates, and parts of his empire get broken off by various successor kings, and Macedonia falls to the Antipatrids, of which Cassander was probably the most famous one of Alexander's companions, someone he was rumoured not to get on very well with. But archaeologists believe that the city massively expanded in the sort of the late 4th century BC, and the main part of the city that we have today is probably from this huge extension. It essentially gets sort of levelled by a major earthquake in the first decade of the 1st century BC, and that seems to kill Pella. Only sort of, lingers on in a few places, but really the sort of the centre of the kingdom has moved to other places under Roman control after that. But what's quite interesting is that we have quite a good sequence of archaeology, and actually a lot of the finds that have been discovered, are still preserved under this destruction layer of this earthquake. So it's a fascinating sort of time capsule in a way. But yeah, the dimensions of the Hellenistic extension of Pella are amazing, because it was obviously really, really built to impress. And, the successors of Alexander had a lot of wealth behind them. They had the wealth of Alexander's conquest behind them. And they built to a scale that hadn't really been seen in Greece before, I think. And although Pella is not too well known today, I think it was absolutely a rival in its heyday for places like Alexandria and Rhodes and Antioch and places like, even early Rome as well, I think, in a way. And you really get that sense when you walk around it. Not only can you see these sort of broad boulevards and avenues, we have these opulent houses with these fantastic mosaics, we have sort of a large Hellenistic bathhouse, and at its sort of centre, at ancient Pella's centre, is this absolutely vast agora, or marketplace, this which is supposed to be the largest agora space in the ancient world. It sort of measures like 200 metres across or something. It's absolutely colossal. And that's where archaeologists have been sort of focusing their excavations for the past sort of couple of decades. And they've come up with some really interesting stuff. They figured out that parts of the agora with its, shops fronted by porticos were zoned. You had administrative areas and some shrines to the north. You had pottery and workshops on the east. You had butchers and fishmongers and more metalworking on the south. And then you had sort of wine shops and terracotta vases and terracotta figurine sellers in the west. So, it's incredible insight into actually the mercantile strength of ancient Pella and how many goods were coming, from all over the Mediterranean world to be sold here. So it's a fantastic sort of snapshot, I guess, of Pella at its height. And the other huge building is to the north, quite a long way to the north, actually, and that's the Royal Palace, which is where archaeologists have been working for the past couple of years, I think since 2017 or so, essentially trying to restore this palace because it was undoubtedly one of the most important buildings in the ancient world. I mean, it covered 75,000 square meters, something like that. It consisted of several buildings sort of terraced into the slope. And this was the nerve center of the Macedonian Empire, a place that Alexander the Great would have known very well, a place that, he might have even grew up in. The beginning of the dating of it is quite difficult to discern, but certainly was there. Probably the mid-4th century BC, when Alexander was in his boyhood. He was born in 356 BC. And it's just great to see this building sort of coming back into life because for years it's been sort of out of bounds and it's been a very, very difficult site to sort of get your head around because the archaeology is not very well preserved. It's been heavily looted. A lot of the local limestone is a bit flaky and doesn't preserve very well. So what's really interesting, the archaeologists have gone there. They're starting to redo or restore the main buildings of this absolutely gigantic complex and get an insight into not only its grand dimensions, but how it worked. This was a public palace, loads of areas for drinking and feasting and meetings and religious rites. So you really get the sense of the Macedonian world coming together in these really opulent buildings. So I'm just so happy that it's going to be opening, hopefully in the near future, for people to have a walk around because, like I said, it is one of the most important buildings in the ancient world and just been so heavily overlooked, I think, in the past.
So you talk about what survives, Alex? Is it basically like a floor plan, or have they got elements of, I don't know, columns, etc., things in rooms? So you talk about the destruction of the town, because of course, I think sometimes the way you speak of it, people imagine something you can walk into, but is it very much something at kind of surface level?
Yeah, so this has always been the problem that, the archaeology has been quite fragmentary and going back a couple of years when I first went there, you had to walk around with a plan because otherwise you had sort of no idea where you are. Buildings are on different levels. The sort of the scale of the site as well is very difficult to get your head around. The Macedonians weren't great builders in marble, for instance. A lot of the time they built in local volcanic stone and then stuccoed everything. So, and a lot of that stuff just, the stucco disintegrates and the local stone weathers quite badly and is just carted off by a lot of, locals over the years. So it is a difficult site to get your head around. What the restorations have done is essentially cleared up these two main buildings, the core of the palace, if you want, buildings 1 and 2, they were called. And they've laid sort of gravel to sort of demarcate where the rooms were. They've supplemented some of the sort of broken walls with new sort of ashlar blocks to give a sense of, some, scale. They have put some of the fragmentary columns back in there. So I haven't seen it. I've seen some early photographs of it, but it does look very, very exciting. What's really interesting about the site today is that what you essentially see is this huge Hellenistic expansion of the city that happened after Alexander the Great's conquests and all the money that flowed back into Macedonia after those conquests. But the Pella that Alexander knew is a little bit harder to find. I should say, actually, that when you go to the site today, it is quite misleading because it's many miles inland. But actually, during Alexander's time in the mid-4th century BC, the Pella was a port city. It had a large harbour frontage, probably a lagoon provided access to the Thermaic Gulf, so the northern Aegean Sea, essentially. And that's why Pella became incredibly important, because it had these links to the sea, which the previous Macedonian capital, Ege, didn't have. So that's certainly one of the reasons why Pella became important under Philip II and Alexander the Great. But what's interesting is that archaeologists don't know much about this early Pella. There's been a new project recently kicked off by the local effort, the sort of local Department of Archaeology and the University of Michigan, to actually do more geophysics along where they think the classical city was, which is sort of south of what we can see today, the Hellenistic remains. And they have managed to trace sort of much of the harbour frontage. They've located this sort of little island that was located just offshore that we know when the Romans conquered it in 168 BC was being used as sort of a treasury and a citadel by the last Macedonian kings. So that's sort of quite a key topographic feature. But it is sort of quite frustrating because there's so much more we want to know about this early Pella. Where was the early palace? Was it quite close to the waterfront, potentially? Or was it underneath the later Hellenistic palace further to the north? But, hopefully this new work is going to provide a clearer picture of what Pella was, which in turn will tell us more about how it expanded and a lot about the later history of the site as well.
I mean, just looking at Google Earth, you'd have no idea that it was you'd have no idea it's a port city because it's miles from the coast. Obviously, a lot of cities, ancient cities across the Mediterranean, are now quite a distance from the sea, whether it's Pompeii or Ostia or Agropoli in southern Italy. But this one is, the shoreline has moved, I don't know how many miles, but it's a long way.
Yeah, and also like the landscapes change quite a lot. It's a very agriculturally rich area where they grow a lot of cotton there, they grow a lot of rice there. But actually you sort of have to go to the estuaries of the Axios and the Ludius rivers, which are national parks today, to get a sense of what Pella might have been like, because it's there that you get the sense of, these waterways winding through the marshlands and these water meadows, and there's areas where there's still sort of wild horses going around and flamingos, and today you go to Pella, it's just a sort of agricultural barren land. Not barren, but it's very empty. You don't get that sort of sense of this incredibly dynamic riverine landscape that Pella sat in amongst. And it was the marshes that surround it that was another reason why they founded the capital there, because it was well protected from enemies. But the landscape was dramatically sort of drained in the early 1920s, I think, and that has completely transformed the feel, I think, of visiting Pella today. And, also Pella wasn't occupied, or the area of the classical city and later Hellenistic city wasn't really occupied, or didn't become a huge big city later on. The focus of the kingdom sort of changed a lot throughout the Hellenistic and Roman and late antique periods, but mainly, it's Thessaloniki that became the huge great city that was founded by one of Alexander's successors, Cassander, in 315 BC, and that was the place that became the centre of what was one of the most important parts of the Roman Empire, and onwards really into Byzantine times and things like that. So Pella was sort of, a little bit like the sea retreating from Pella. People retreated from Pella and sort of left it, high and dry. But that's quite good for us in terms of archaeology, because it means that this stuff remains under agricultural fields instead of under houses, which can be a lot harder to get at.
There's something I don't think you mentioned about Pella. Is there any evidence of temples or singular important temple complex? You kind of mentioned, religion, if you like, can be weaved into a lot of buildings through shrines, etc. But do we have something like that? You've mentioned the huge palace, Alex, but do we find a big temple there and a cult statue, or do we know of any gods that would have inhabited Pella?
So Macedonian temple architecture is not fully understood, if I'm honest. The examples of Macedonian temples that we have are very, very small. They seem to have not gone in for building these huge, great edifices, like, say, the Athenians would, or the Thebans or something like that. They seem to be quite small and quite rustic. The ones in Pella, appear almost like houses, essentially. They have a small courtyard and a few areas for offerings and areas for cult statues and things like that. Certainly in Pella, they are worshipping, we know Athena is a key god. Athena of the people is a key god. They haven't found her temple yet, but they found lots of terracotta figurines. We know that the Macedonians are heavily into Aphrodite, or the women especially heavily into Aphrodite and the mother of the gods. We know that Dionysus is very important, and we have the stories of, obviously, Alexander's mother, Olympias, being heavily involved in the Bacchic rites. And what's quite interesting is that excavations in Pella, they've actually found the cuts in the ground, which seem to reveal that they were where the vines had been planted on the sides of the hill and stuff. So we have the actual evidence of them growing wine in Pella, and certainly there's written testimony for that as well. We know Poseidon as well, with it being a port city. There's something to do with Poseidon there, I'm not too sure what. Apollo as well is very popular with the Macedonians. There's a local healing god called Daron. There's a Thesmophorion, a ritual pit for Demeter and her daughter Persephone or Kore. So, there's a typical sort of Greek pantheon to be found in Pella, but they certainly have the sort of favourite gods. Obviously, Zeus. We haven't found a temple for Zeus in Pella yet, but we know that at another site at the base of Mount Olympus, so Mount Olympus is in Macedonia, that there's this massive sacred city called Zeus's city, Dion or Dion, and that's where the main cult centre of Zeus is. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's another cult centre for Zeus somewhere in Pella or its vicinity, because obviously he was the god of kingship, and he was the one that, Macedonian kings had to, embellish with praise and things like that. But yeah, we're not getting these huge, great edifices. They're a lot more small, a lot more local.
Yeah, I find that really surprising. It's really different from classical architecture, isn't it? And the temple. And then, of course, that's what the Romans pick up on, and it is all about the temple. And as you've said, they don't seem to have built in marble. But again, classical Greeks, Romans love their marble and build these huge things. So yeah, that's quite fascinating to me. It seems very different.
Just as kind of Glyn, your love of amber in the last episode came out of your the colour of your beard, Alex. Your interest in Alexander? I mean, is that... I mean, these things are very simplistic.
They are, yeah.
You managed to make them simplistic, Chris. That's a knack you have.
But yeah, no, well, hopefully that's persuaded you to take a trip out to Northern Greece, guys. And I'll be banging on about it for a few more episodes, I'm sure, in the future. But good stuff, guys. Thanks for listening to me drone on, and we'll see you next time. Cheers, then.
Cheers.
Yeah.